Welcome to Highline Excel 2013, video number 11. Hey, if you want to download this workbook, Business 214 Week 3, click on the link below the video. Hey, in the last few videos and throughout the class, we have talked about AND criteria. So if you have a bunch of conditions or criteria, all conditions and criteria must get a true in order for the number or the transaction to be considered in the calculation. We want to talk about OR criteria here. OR criteria, you have a bunch of criteria or conditions or logical tests. But for OR criteria, at least one condition must be true. Now, that means that if you have two criteria, only one of them has to come out to be true for the number or the transaction to be included in the calculation. Now, let's look at our first example. Now, in this example, we have sales team 1, and Gigi and Mo are on sales team 1. And we need to count how many sales did this sales team have. Now, this is going to involve OR criteria. Notice we have 1, 2 criteria. But check this out for OR criteria. When we ask the question, we're going to go over to our data set, and each transaction, right? We're not going to be looking at the whole transaction. We're going to be looking at the sales rep column. For each transaction, we ask two questions. Is whatever sales rep name here equal to Gigi? True. Is whatever sales rep name here equal to Mo? False. So for this first one, we got a true and a false. As long as we get one true, we're going to count it. Now, the next transaction, the next sales rep name, we have to ask two questions. Is that sales rep name equal to Gigi? False. Is it equal to Mo? True. In this case, we got false, true. Because we got one true, we have to count it. We go to the next one. Is that name equal to Gigi? False. Is that one equal to Mo? False. We get two falses, so we do not count that transaction. Now, anytime we have a situation like that, and by the way, we're never going to get two trues. Later in this week in one of the videos, we'll see a situation where we have OR criteria, where we get potentially more than one true. But here, we're never going to get that in this column. So if that's the case, we can just use COUNTIF. So I'm going to use COUNTIF or S. I'm going to use the S because I like the screen tips better. All right, so criteria range. I'm going to highlight the entire sales rep. Control-Shift down arrow F4, comma, and then the criteria, Gigi. I'm going to close this off. That's one COUNTIF. Right now, it would just be counting all of Gigi's. But because we're never going to get two trues, we can simply use two COUNTIFs in the same formula. So I'm going to do plus. Notice I cheated. I highlighted that and copied. Now I'm going to Control V, and I'm simply going to double click. Instead of Gigi, I'm going to click on Mo. There you go. That is a cheap and easy way to do OR criteria. Now I've locked that. That one's relative, so I can Control Enter and copy it over. F2. There is a way to do OR criteria counting, where we don't ever have the chance of getting two trues. Now, let's just look at an example. What would happen if we did get two trues here? If we were asking the question, is the transaction from the West region or is it Gigi? I made a little data set here just so we could see this. I did two COUNTIFs, but what's the problem? We can get two trues. So if I'm asking first COUNTIF, are you equal to West? And second COUNTIFs, are you equal to Gigi? Well, true, true. This COUNTIFs will get one. This one will also get one. That will double count. So you got to be careful. Our situation here, where we're asking the OR criteria of a single column, or later we'll ask it of the customer or the region, no problem. You can use two COUNTIFs or two COUNTIF functions for counting. Now, I want you to notice something. This is sales team 1, sales team 1. So these are not proper field names. If we have a slightly different situation down here, if we have the actual field name from the column, there's an easier way. We can use D functions. Now, last video, when we did AND criteria, we saw that we can use D functions, database functions. And the requirements for database functions are that you have a proper data set with field names at the top and records and rows. And your criteria has to have a field name above it. Now, the cool thing about OR criteria is you just list your field name and then you list as many OR criteria below, and boom, you can use DCOUNTA. Count with an A counts non-empty cells, which is perfect because our column has text. So I'm going to tab. It needs the whole database, including the field names. Now watch this. I'm going to click up in the upper left corner. Control, and I can't use my Control asterisk here, which is a bummer. That's a keyboard to highlight the whole range. But I can do Control Shift right arrow, down arrow. I am copying this, so I'm going to hit F4 to lock it. So there's our whole database, comma. The field, that's the name of the field you're doing the calculation upon. So I'm simply going to boop, highlight that there. As we saw last video, you can put a cell reference. You can actually put this field name in double quotes, or you can count how many columns it is and put the number there. Control Z. I'm going to leave it as a cell reference, comma. And then the criteria, you have to have field name and then the OR criteria below the field name. Close parentheses, and I can Control Enter. So that might be a little bit easier. We get the same answer there. Let me scroll up and look. So we get the same answer. So if we have field names, we can use the D functions for various calculations. All right, hey, let's go look at a similar example, but for adding. All right, so we have our internet group Amazon and Google. And we need to pick up all the sales from the sales column for these two customers and add them. Well, in this situation, we do not have a field name. Here we do. So here, instead of two COUNTIFs, we can use two SUMIFS. Sum range. Click in the first one. Control Shift down arrow. Control backspace because I don't need to lock it, but I want to jump the screen back in view. There's our sum range. Comma, criteria range. Go get the customers. Control Shift down arrow. Control backspace. Comma, criteria. Hey, here's where we give it Amazon, close parentheses. Now I'm going to copy this in edit mode, Control C. Very carefully come to the end. By the way, if your cursor turns to a selection cursor, if you click, it would put in a cell reference. So you want to make sure it's the I-beam and click at the end, plus Control V. Now I'm going to double click, and instead of Amazon, I'm going to click on Google. Control Enter. We are adding with OR criteria. We look through this column. It says, is each transaction Amazon or Google? Anytime we got a true here or here, we use the number in this column. If we got two falses, we didn't use the number. Control Enter. Here we have field name, so we can use our D functions. And we're adding, so we'll use equals DSUM. Database. Now I need to go up, highlight from the top. I'm going to use my keyboard, a navigation keyboard, Control Home to jump up to the top. Now the dancing answer dancing. Now I'm going to do Control Shift right arrow and then down arrow. Control backspace to jump back up. I do not need to lock those. I see my database. If I type a comma, the field. I need the sales field. So because I don't have the sales field name here or in a cell, I'm going to put it in double quotes. Somehow the database DSUM function needs to know, it needs to know which field to do the calculation upon. All right, so field. And then criteria. Anytime you're using these D functions, got to have field name. And if it's OR criteria, you list the OR criteria each on a different row. Close parentheses. If you remember access, studying access in Business 216, we did our OR criteria in a query on different rows. Same here for D functions. OR criteria on different rows or different lines. Control Enter. Of course, we get the same answer. Sometimes we have to use multiple SUMIFS, sometimes we have to use our D functions. D functions are great if you have a proper data set with your field names at the top, and in the criteria range you have to have your field name and then the criteria listed below. All right, now those examples had 2 OR criteria only. What do you do if you have a lot? All right, so here we have customer group number 1 and we have 6 customers. Well, we certainly could do this with an extra helper column, right? If we wanted to see all these individual totals, then that is a beautiful solution. We do 6 individual SUMIFS all the way down to the last one. And then we simply add them up. Now, if you have a field name, and I don't have one, so watch this. I'm going to copy this. Copy the title up here for our group and all of our criteria, Control C, and I'm going to come over to the side and write in J. I'm going to Control V. And now I'm going to change this at the top, F2, and I'm going to backspace. Now watch this. I'm going to make a mistake here. If I'm going to use D functions, at the top of the criteria has to be the field name. If you have an extra space, if you were to go up here and put this in edit mode, it will not work. So the idea for D functions is that that field name is the communication to the function to say, hey, that's the field I want. So be sure it's exactly the same. I'm going to backspace and get rid of that space. I'm actually going to highlight this and boop, drag it up one. Watch this. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to highlight this, copy, paste, and then I'm going to delete the formula. I got the label and then the formatting I want. All right, you ready? We're adding here. So D, we have field name at the top. We have a proper data set over here, so I'm going to go equals DSUM. All right, database, Control Shift Home. Over here, Control Shift right arrow, down arrow. Control backspace. I'm not copying this anywhere, so I don't need to lock it. There's our database, comma, field, sales, comma, and then the criteria. What's so powerful about the D functions is, right, if I was going to use my multiple SUMIFS, I'd have to type 6 SUMIFS. So I highlight the field name and all of the OR criteria, 1 on each row. And no way, boom, all in one cell, we get a railroad track. No, we come up here and expand the column with exactly the same number in a single cell. Now, that's beautiful. It's not always the case that you have the field name at the top of the criteria or that you have a proper data set. In that case, we can use what's called a function argument array operation. Now, what the trick to this is that if we look up here, when we did individual SUMIFS, we did how many of them? Well, there were 6 criteria, so 6 different SUMIFS functions. Well, there's a great, in essence, array formula trick when you have OR criteria. So now we want to look at that solution. Again, we don't have the field name here, and other times you may not have a proper data set, or even other times the D functions don't work so well when you have to copy the formula, and we'll see an example later in this video. All right, so let's look at the SUMIFS. Now we're going to use the SUMIFS to do OR criteria. The sum range, we still got to give it that. Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace. Sum range, criteria range, I still got to give it all of the customers. Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace. And here's the trick, comma, criteria 1. Let's just remind ourselves how this argument usually works. I give it a single piece, right? Well, SUMIFS, what you're doing is if you give criteria 1 criteria, it's instructing SUMIFS to spit out 1 answer. So watch this. I could highlight this in edit mode and use our evaluation key, F9. Well, OK. Look up here. Exactly the same number. That makes perfect sense. That's what the SUMIFS does. Control Z to undo that. But watch this. It's expecting a single item. We're going to give it a bunch of items. Now how many items did I give it? 6. So anytime you do what's called a function argument array operation. Why is it an array? Because I gave it an array of items. But anytime you do an array operation in a function argument, there's 6 different items we're given it. That means SUMIFS will spit out 6 different answers. So I can highlight this and watch this. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit so we can see all of these. And right here I'm going to hit F9. It spits out an array of answers. And this is a very special type. You see the curly brackets and then the semicolon. And each number is separated by semicolon. And then finally we have a closing curly bracket. That means that function is spitting out an array of answers. And that's amazing. It is as if in a single cell we did each individual one of these SUMIFS. I'm going to Control Z. So a rule you can think of is when you're doing OR criteria, you just slap them all in there and the function will spit out a bunch of answers. Now there's one problem. That's 6 numbers. When I hit Enter, well, it can't display 6 numbers in a cell. And there's one other problem. If you scroll over here, our goal is to add those numbers, right? So if I hit the F2 key, well, the SUM function is not programmed to automatically add results from an array operation. Now later when we talk about array formulas, we'll talk more about the SUM function. But right now if I hit Enter, it's flat out not going to work. That SUM function is not automatically programmed to add from an array operation. But no way, there's a function called SUMPRODUCT. So I'm going to come over here. Instead of SUM, let's use SUMPRODUCT. When you have a single array operation, that means that SUMIFS is spitting out F9, an array of numbers, and you want to add them, use SUMPRODUCT. Because SUMPRODUCT is programmed to handle and add an array of values from an array operation. Now I'm going to Control Z and close parentheses. Watch this, Enter. Boom. Now why did we have to do that complicated calculation? Well, we didn't have the field name up here. The trick is put all of your criteria into that Criteria.1 argument, wrap it in SUMPRODUCT, and boom, you have your answer. Now let's scroll down here. All right, so we're looking at a different problem down here. This situation, we want to do count and sum, and we have our field name. So we can use the DCOUNTA for counting, since we're counting non-empty cells. Control-Shift-Home, Control-Shift-Right, down, F4. Comma, that's our database. Our field name, we are counting on the customer field, no spaces in that field name, comma, and then our criteria, I'm going to make sure and highlight from the field name down. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to drag this over. F2, and then watch this. I'm going to point to the edge of the range and click and drag. All right, so DCOUNTA is quite easy. You don't have to do that function argument array operation. We have our field names. We could do the same thing for DSUM. Control-Shift-Home, Control-Shift-Right, down, F4, comma. Field name, sale, comma. And here I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to use my arrow keys to go up and hunt. And once I get the first one at the bottom, I'm going to hold Shift and then up, 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 up. That is a relative cell reference. Close parentheses, Control Enter. And then I'm going to copy it over. F2, and then click and drag that corner. All right, so if we have our field name and we're doing OR criteria, each OR criteria is on a different line, D functions are awesome. Now, we talked about the fact that when you don't have a field name, then you have to switch over to something else. Also, if you didn't have a proper data set with field names at the top, then you can't use those D functions. Here's another situation. Now here our calculation's going to be counting. And look at this. For each one of these cells in this column, I need to get customer group 1, which is OR criteria. But as I copy it down, I have an additional AND criteria for Southwest, North, and Midwest. This is a situation where the D functions, because of the requirement for how the criteria argument is set up, won't allow us to create a single formula and copy it down. All right, so you ready? We're going to have to use, because we're counting, COUNTIFS. And this is going to be a wild formula. The criteria range, well, we have the customer column to consider and the region. Now, I want to jump all the way up there, and I'm down at like row 93. So I'm going to use Control Home and then just redirect it. Remember, as long as the dancing ants are moving, you can redirect it. So now I click at the top of the customer, Control Shift down arrow F4. There's my criteria range 1 and comma. Now I do this function argument array operation. Now when I copy this down, I want it locked, but when I copy it to the side, I don't want it locked, so I need to lock it with the F4 1 and 2 times. Row lock, but not the column. That means when I copy it this way, the H will move to I. All right, you ready? Comma. Now criteria range 2, which is going to be the region column. Control Shift Home, redirect it, Control Shift down arrow F4, comma, and now I have my criteria 2, a single cell. Now this is doing OR, but that's a lot of OR, and now we have an AND. I'm going to have to lock this south. When I copy this way, it needs to be locked, so I hit the F4 1, 2, 3 times, lock the column. When I copy it down, I want it to move, so not the row. Close parentheses. Now I'm going to highlight this, and let's hit the F9. F9. Guess what? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 answers because I gave it 6 OR criteria. But these answers are Pete's count in the south, Costco's count in the south, QFC's count in the south. That is amazing. Control Z. Now we need to add all of the counts. Sum is not going to do it, so I'm going to use SUMPRODUCT. Why? Because when I have an array operation that's spitting out a bunch of answers, and that's what the COUNTIFS is doing, the array argument can handle it. It'll take that array operation result and simply add it. Control Enter. Copy it down. Now I'm going to copy it over to the side, but guess what? Click in the top cell, F2. Oh, look at that. So I'm going to cheat and grab that and drag it down. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. So that is a wild formula. Here we've done both a function argument array operation to spit out, in this case, 7 answers, but we also had an additional AND criteria here. All right, so in this video we talked a lot about OR criteria. Even in this last one we did OR and AND. In our next video we will talk, and we've already talked about, but we'll talk more about the D functions. All right, see you next video.